Good afternoon, everybody. I'm Ermin Sinanovic at the United States Naval Academy, but everything I say here is my personal opinion, and I want to make clear that it doesn't represent official views of the United States Naval Academy or the Department of Defense, which I think will become pretty obvious very soon. So my job here is to say a few things about our effort in trying to do nation building in Bosnia and Herzegovina after our intervention there in 1995, and then to compare some of what we've done there to what has been done in Iraq. And again, another thing that sometimes we in America don't do well is we don't pronounce proper names properly. So it is Sinanovic, but it's also Iraq and not Iraq, as it is often said, and you probably know that. So just to kind of backtrack a little bit to the 1990s, after a 3.5-year-long war in Bosnia, there came what could be known as the Dayton Peace Agreement, named after the Dayton Air Force Base in Ohio, where our government brought the three warring factions from Bosnia, the Bosniaks, Bosnian Muslims, the Bosnian Croats, and the Bosnian Serbs, as well as the leaders of the neighboring countries of Serbia and Croatia, to the negotiating table to conclude the war in Bosnia and bring about the peace agreement. And after that peace agreement, we were faced with rebuilding, of perhaps more properly put, building democracy in Bosnia and Herzegovina, because just as Bosnia was making transition into democracy after the fall of communism in the former Yugoslavia, the war started and democracy really never had a chance to take its roots. So we were really building democracy there. Divisions within the country were deep back then, and the emphasis that I think the international community took after the war in Bosnia was on inter-elite cohesion and agreement. In other words, the leading elites were identified, and they were identified on the basis of their leadership within different, what is called ethnic or religious communities in Bosnia. The Bosniaks, Bosnian Muslims, the Croats, and the Serbs. And what this happened was created a kind of top-down approach to democracy, where the heavy emphasis was put at the people at the top, the elites, and most ordinary citizens were left out of that process. And this is what is called in literature, and what I also call the elite fallacy, which empowered then the nationalist elites in Bosnia, strengthened their political appeal and capital, and transferred a lot of wealth into their hands. The country's citizens' roles were reduced to periodic elections. You know, every 4 or 5 years you go out, you give your vote, and then you go back home and sit down and watch how these nationalist elites are negotiating among themselves, or more properly put, how they are grabbing whatever they can in the meantime. And I think there is a lot of parallels there between what happened in Bosnia and what happened especially in Iraq, but also applies, I think, to Afghanistan. Yes, there has been some investment into civil society and civic organizations in Bosnia, just like later in Iraq, but by and large, this wasn't the priority. The priority was to put emphasis on the elites at the top and to make them come to some sort of a bargain or agreement through negotiating process. So there was no deepening of democracy in Bosnia and Herzegovina, and I would argue similar perspective applies in Iraq. Now, the result of this approach to building democracy was the centralization of powers in the hands of the nationalist elites, whose interest was to deepen inter-ethnic mistrust and animosities, because that's how they remain in power. They don't remain in power by creating more trust among different people in the country. They actually entrench their power by creating even deeper animosities and deeper mistrust among the constituents. And so here we are, 16 years later in Bosnia, after the war ended in 1995, in November of 1995, so almost 16 years later. The country is as divided as it has ever been, is actually more divided today than it has been in 1995, with very low levels of inter-ethnic trust and cooperation. And the electoral system that we helped create in Bosnia, when I say we, I mean the United States and the whole international community, provided for voting based on ethnic and nationalist identities. And this was repeated later on in Iraq. In other words, if you're a member of, let's say, Bosnian Croat community, you vote, when you get the ballot list, you vote based on, if you're a Croat, you vote for the Croat person to represent you in the government. You don't vote for who you think is the best person in the whole country. Basically, you vote on your ethnicity. And just think of it, if here in America, we had a voting list, and if you're African American, you can vote only for African American and elect who's going to represent you, and the Latinos elect the Latino person, and so on and so forth. This would be unacceptable, but yet this was the system that we helped create in Bosnia, and to some extent repeated in Iraq. And then the state institutions that were created follow the same pattern. There was always this notion that there should be a representation for the Bosniaks and the Croats and the Serbs, just like later in Iraq there was for the Sunnis, the Shiites, and the Kurds, right? And that in itself basically puts the institution in such a way that it perpetuates this ethnic and religious and sectarian divisions. I think this is evocative because when we invaded and occupied Iraq, I think there was, prior to the war in Iraq, and to make war look legitimate, one of the arguments that was used is that the Sunnis were a minority in Iraq and they were persecuting the oppressed Shiite majority. And so in a way, this was interpreted by the Sunnis not only in Iraq by attack on Iraq, as an attack on Iraq, but it was seen as an attack on the Sunnis. And so we went into Iraq with this notion that, yes, there are Iraqis, but they are really the Sunnis, the Shiites, and the Kurds. And that was perpetuated later on in many of the institutions that we helped create in Iraq. One needs to recall, and here is where the comparison, again, between Bosnia and Iraq is really, I think, important. When, during the hearings, Congress hearings, before our invasion of Iraq, when General Shinseki, who was the commander of the NATO operations in post-war Bosnia, was asked, how many people would we need in post-war Iraq, provided we go in, invade, we are successful militarily, how many people would we need to stabilize? And Shinseki said, well, we had 80,000 troops in Bosnia. Bosnia is a very small country, about 4 million people. Based on that, in Iraq, we would need about 650,000 troops. And Paul Wolfowitz, who was the deputy in the second man in the Department of Defense at the time, said, anyone who says that we would need hundreds of thousands of soldiers to stabilize Iraq doesn't know what he's talking about. General Shinseki was a 4-star general, and he didn't know what he was talking about. That was the suggestion. So what is happening now in both of these countries are that both are facing deep divisions and grave challenges, and it won't be an exaggeration to say that they would both need decades before a more robust, functional democracy is in place. And that, I think, would open up a lot of questions about to what extent, for instance, has our intervention been helpful in creating democracy and in post-war reconstruction. And I will leave you with a counterfactual, and the historians especially like counterfactuals. So, and I'm looking at one of them in the audience. Had we not invaded Iraq in 2003, would we be seeing now, these days, uprising against Saddam Hussein by the Iraqis that would perhaps be more likely to foster a more genuine democracy? It's something to think about. Thank you so much.